making sure. Well, good evening. Well, welcome to the God or No God debate, and we appreciate each of you taking time out of your busy schedules to be here. We're excited to be able to hold this event. We anticipate a wonderful evening, and we hope that you will leave tonight better educated not only about the topics presented tonight, but about the importance of having an open and civil dialogue with those who hold different core beliefs than you do. And there are many worldviews, but in a narrow sense tonight, we're going to be examining only two: belief that there is a God and the lack of that belief. And the topic tonight, as you may well know, is God or No God, which explains reality. And we hope that the collision of these worldviews will cause us all to examine our thinking and make sure that we have been diligent in our choices. We have Matt Oxley, who will be presenting the atheistic position, and over here Rip Snow will present the Christian theistic position. Now, each of these guys will flesh out their reasons for holding their worldview as the debate proceeds. I direct your attention on the wall over here to our sponsors. This event would not be possible without the help and support of our sponsors, and I want to thank them publicly. They were among the first in our community to recognize the potential that this debate has to generate a real positive and civil discourse around this important and yet sometimes divisive topic. Now let me take care of some housekeeping items, some ground rules. I'm sure that you will find yourself in strong agreement or disagreement at various times this evening. Please refrain from any demonstration of those emotions during the debaters' presentations. In other words, no clapping, cheers, jeers, gasps, or any other display that will hinder the people around you's ability to be able to hear the presenter. So please refrain from your applause until at the end of each speaker's presentation. If you would take a moment and silence your cell phones, and please no pictures. We will be recording the event, both audio and video, and we will have that available online. You can check at the godornogoddebate.com site or Facebook, God or No God Debate. Give it about 3 days, and we'll have links to that. You probably are already aware, but the bathrooms are in the back to your right. If you need to, just excuse yourself as quietly as possible. And at the end of the debate, there will be a time for Q&A, so you will be able to participate. If you have questions as the debate proceeds, jot them down and ask one or the other of the presenters tonight. We have a lot to cover, so we're going to just dive right in. I will now call our first debater, Rip Snow, to present his theistic worldview defense for 15 minutes. These are timed. I will also be letting you know when you have 5 minutes, 2 minutes, and 1 minute.
In other words, you'll scare us to death.
You ready? Go.
Thank you all for coming this evening, and I have to say as well, I appreciate there are many families that are involved this evening who's made this event possible. And to look and to see this many people participating, and some of you have come from some distance, so we really appreciate it, and to all of the sponsors as well. I'm going to set for myself a threefold project this evening to present the reason that I believe God's existence does better explain reality. The first will be an existential and moral. The second will be a scientific, brief look at science, and the third will be an historical presentation. We are the only terrestrial creatures that ask a reason why for the things that are. None of the higher animals, so far as we can tell, do this. And since 300 years ago, in the Enlightenment era, we have begun to ask that question in a new way. We have begun, because of scientific advancement, to ask that question excluding a creator from the paradigm. And this has some tremendous implications. As science has become to be seen as omnicompetent, that is, if it doesn't know now, it will, we have begun to ask this question and open ourselves to implications that are very serious for we who live on this planet. All of life ultimately becomes nothing but a biological byproduct of forces that are blind. And these same blind forces that coughed the universe into existence have coughed us here as pieces of the furniture that exists within the universe. And so with that mindset, it gives for you and me no place to anchor an objective value. I'm not even talking about morals here. I'm just talking about the intrinsic human worth. We're in a universe that's running down. Science has told us that this universe will continue to expand. When I started this talk, the universe is expanding faster now than when I began. And because of that, all the particles will separate to such a degree that eventually the particles will spread apart so far that there will be absolutely no heat, no life, and none of us here. Now, all of us in this room understand death. Everybody's been to a funeral. I understand death. But I'm not talking about death. I'm talking about universal non-being. Well, it makes a big difference in how we live our lives because it makes a big difference in how we view ourselves. If we universally face non-being, then what are our lives but just passing time? Jean-Paul Sartre, the French existentialist, atheistic philosopher, said it well. He said, life has no meaning once you lose eternity. He said life has no meaning once you lose the illusion of being eternal, and it doesn't matter whether it's several hours or several days or several years, we're just passing time. So to live life as though it has an objective value is not possible without some place to ground that value. I picture it this way. Here in the South, in this part of the South, I don't know about where some of you are from, but here it's flat. Take a pond. It rains really hard for several days, as it has this week. The pond overflows its banks, and outside the pond there are several pools of water. In those pools of water, you find aquatic creatures who are utterly dependent upon that universe of water. The waters recede back to the pond, leaving the puddles. Those creatures reproduce, chase each other, run from predators, do all the things they normally do, the minnows, the tadpoles, and everything else. But they're just biding time because that puddle will dry up and leave them right where they are to die. As mere accidents in this universe, that describes our lives. Now, to some people, they say, well, we can find meanings in our lives, and that's true, but there's no ultimate meaning. And with no ultimate meaning, we have no place to ground our values except in what we confer to each other. So, as moist clockwork, which is the way that Stephen Hawking describes us, what does it matter? If we as a culture, say a nation, were to decide that everybody under the age of 3 who is physically compromised or mentally compromised or both, they are fit to be put to death so that the rest of us, the right kind of people, can flourish. Or if there's an ethnic group that we can work to death because they're non-humans, because we've determined it to be so, who's to call that into question? If, after all, the only value we have is that which we confer. So, what are we going to do? Well, the only option we really have is what's known as the noble lie. Let's set up some statement and make it transcendent, like the collective consciousness of all humanity cries out against this. Big deal. All somebody has to do is say, says who? And that evaporates completely. So, the noble lie has been tried. It's been tried. They tried it for 70 years in the Soviet Union. What was the noble lie? The proletariat peasant worker. That was the person that was held up as the ideal. But it was a lie. And the problem with it was it lasted for 70 years, but it's just like a placebo. Once a person recognizes a placebo as a placebo, it no longer works because it's not the real thing. And the placebo effect goes away. And what happened in the Soviet Union was, while the Politburo would stand in the lectern and lecture the people on the virtues of the proletariat peasant worker's life, the hammer and the sickle, they would get into a limousine and go to their summer homes and eat caviar while the proletariat peasant worker stood in a line at the state store hoping that they arrived before the bread ran out. They found out it was a lie and it collapsed. With God as a lawgiver, with God to tell you and me what we are worth, all of this goes away in that now we can ground ourselves objectively in an intrinsic value, you and I, that is infinite because God says he's made us in his image. Science tells us that 13.72 billion years ago, we've worked it out to 4 decimal places now, the universe began. It began in you can call it an explosion, now it's called an expansion. Either way, it began. There is a place at which we go back The background radiation tells us that there was a hard beginning for the universe. Well, here we are, and I just would pose this statement to you all. Either something is eternal or something not eternal came from nothing. I don't think there are any alternatives in between that. We don't know of anything within this time-space continuum that comes into existence, that begins to exist without a cause that antecedes it. We don't know of anything. The universe began to exist. So logically, it would seem to me that it has a cause. Well, if the universe has a cause, then it can't be physical, because all of physicality, all of the spatio-temporal matter, energy, time and space that we see began to exist. So this cause has to be outside that. It can't be part of it, because then the universe would have existed before it existed. The universe, therefore, has a cause. The universe's cause is timeless, immaterial, and it seems to me, as I look at the 3.5 billion bit pairs of a DNA molecule, it seems pretty smart, too. The cause must have incredible power, and also the cause cannot just be an abstract thing like a number, because the cause has the volition of will that the universe actually began, and the beginning cannot be anything but simultaneous with the cause, because there was no time prior. What does that leave us with? It seems to me like a good description of the eternal God. Thirdly, 2,000 years ago, there was a man who walked the earth. Now, he spoke about God in a way as to say it was a foregone conclusion that God existed. No question about it for him. And he rose up in the ranks in his culture and began to teach. The teaching was amazing to people because he spoke with authority. He spoke as though he said of himself, the kingdom of God has come in me. That's an astonishing thing for somebody to say. And it got him in a lot of trouble. The religious intelligentsia of his day saw their gig threatened. And they decided they had to do something about this guy. Well, the problem is this guy was living in a culture, as were the people in religious intelligentsia, who could not arrest nor punish. So they were under the Roman Empire's rule. They got the Romans involved. And through some machinations, they got him arrested. They had him hauled from pillar to post, beaten. And then finally, the religious intelligentsia got exactly what they wanted, and they nailed Jesus to a cross. And that was it. The disciples were dejected. The people that had followed him were dejected. They had thought this was the Messiah because the Jews had no idea of a dying and rising Messiah, much less one who would be humiliated and crucified in the way that he was, as a common criminal. As a matter of fact, in the Roman Empire, as the worst kind of criminal. And to the Jews, he was cursed. What are they going to do? So 2 days later, on the third day, some women who were going to take spices to the tomb, because after all, this is before modern embalming, and things started to smell. So they took the spices to the tomb. They found the tomb empty. Where did he go? A little while later, they met him. They ran back and told the others. Well, they thought they were crazy. They thought they were crazy. And then some of the others saw him alive. And then 500 saw him alive. And then his own brother, James, who did not believe, saw him alive and believed. And then, worst of all, a little while later, within less than a year, Saul of Tarsus, who was actually imprisoning those who had followed this renegade way, he believed. He saw him alive. So within 40 days of the crucifixion in 30 A.D., we had the rise of this incredible movement where the same people who were hiding from the religious and the Roman authorities because they saw what happened to Jesus, they were hiding from them. Why? They didn't want it to happen to them. They went out 40 days later, a little over 40 days later, and began to preach the same message that got Jesus arrested and crucified. What happened? They saw him alive. It's the only explanation that explains all of the pertinent facts. They saw him alive. Well, if they saw him alive, then we've got a divine miracle on our hands. The best explanation I know of is just what is said of him, that God raised him from the dead. We've got a universe in front of us. Either something is eternal or something not eternal emerged from nothing. You get to pick. Which one sounds more plausible to you? I'm on the side of something is eternal, and I'm on the side that someone caused it to be. And without God in the paradigm to explain the reality in which we live, you and I are lost in a sea of absolutely relative understandings of how much we are worth. The only worth you and I will ever have will be what someone, either in a governmental place or maybe on a street corner with a pistol, confers to us. With the existence of God to explain our beings ourselves, we find ourselves with infinite worth. And we can ground our morals right there. It's wrong to do these things because those people to whom we're doing these things are of the same worth as I. We share that common humanity of being made in God's image. So as far as I'm concerned, the best explanation of the reality in which we live is that God exists. Thank you very much.
I'd like to introduce Matt Oxley for his introduction.
Thank you. Forgive me for reading mine. It's pre-prepared. The next ones won't be. I'm going to begin with defining some of the terms of the topic at hand. Of course, with our topic, these terms seem to be obvious to most of us, but I think that's largely because we take them for granted. We believe that we know how to define reality because we simply don't think about the implications of what reality actually means and wouldn't know how to function outside of the reality we so easily assume and take for granted. But just what is reality? How should we define it, and when we do define it, how then should we determine which claims ought to fit within that reality? Ultimately, answering these two questions is the point of this debate, with the secondary point of determining whether or not any god or gods may be allowed access to that understanding of it. Reality is defined as the world or state of things as they actually exist, as opposed to an idealistic or notional idea of them. Rather than falling into the trap of solipsism, which epistemological questions tend to bring us into, and which the greatest philosophers over the centuries haven't been able to fully satisfy, I'm going to ask my opponent to agree to a definition of reality that's dependent upon something that we have some sort of grasp on, our physical senses. This approach is called empiricism, and we all act as empiricists every day. You don't touch a hot stovetop because in the past you've been burned by something hot. You probably avoided walking into walls because you've seen them in front of you, and even people without the sense of sight grow accustomed to using their audible senses to hear the walls and obstacles around them and navigate the world quite successfully. Empiricism is a theory that all knowledge is derived from sense experience. It works. That's why we rely upon it on a daily basis. That's why science relies upon it for experimentation, and why every medication you take, every time you start your car, and every time you flip a light switch, you can have a reasonable amount of confidence that doing so won't cause a massive explosion. You are all empiricists, just like me, and you perform experiments that rely on empiricism on a daily basis. For those that may not be familiar with the terminology surrounding theistic belief and knowledge, I offer the following agreeable definition. A theist is a person who believes in a god or gods. An atheist is a person who does not believe in a god or gods, as the letter A denotes being without. A Gnostic is a person who claims knowledge in regards to the existence of God or gods, and an agnostic is a person who claims no knowledge in regards to the existence of God or gods. Theism and atheism explain one's belief. Agnostic and Gnostic explain one's knowledge. I suspect that we'll be going back over some of the finer details of these later on, but to put my position into perspective for the audience, I think it's important to point out that I am an agnostic atheist, meaning that I have no knowledge of the existence of God and no belief in the existence of God. Why is God unnecessary and illogical as an explanation for reality? I'm going to start with number one, cosmology. I'm going to make a logical argument now against God, starting with the law of non-contradiction, which states that something cannot be both A and not A at the same time and in the same sense. The law of excluded middle states that something is either A or not A. The law of identity states that if something is A, then it is A. If logic is part of God's nature, then God is logic because as the creator of all things, logic must also flow from him. Therefore, it is impossible for God to do that which is outside of the logically possible. God cannot violate the law of non-contradiction by creating a rock that is so heavy that even he can't lift it, or by creating a circle that is also a square. The law of conservation of matter and energy states that matter and energy can neither be created nor destroyed, and they can only change forms. Creation ex nihilo, or creation from nothing, as asserted by my opponent, requires that the universe violate the laws of its own nature by requiring that the matter and energy contained within the universe come from nothing. A universe created by God ex nihilo would mean that God is in violation of the laws of logic that govern the universe, specifically those laws mentioned previously. Since the universe itself cannot be anything other than that which appears to logically be an uncreated thing existing eternally, for God to have created the universe would mean that God broke the laws that he created. Second, abiogenesis and evolution. Abiogenesis is when life comes from non-life. If you were to build a model of a sea creature on the beach and out of sand and have it suddenly turn into a living being, that would be a very extreme and entirely unlikely version of abiogenesis. In the middle of the 20th century, two scientists, Stanley Miller and Harold Urey, conducted an experiment that lasted for a number of years. This experiment was set up to determine whether or not, given an atmosphere free of organic compounds, or compounds derived from living things and entirely free of life, even the tiniest of bacteria, life could come from non-life. So they sterilized a series of glass tubes and containers and then sealed them all together in a loop. Inside the vessels, they put water, methane, ammonia, and hydrogen. The water and ammonia mixture was placed over a flame to allow it to evaporate and run steam up a tube that eventually wound up in a gas chamber where hydrogen and methane were present. Inside this same chamber were two electrodes were placed close enough that they would spark like lightning. After passing through this phase, the steam was condensed and would return to the water chamber. This experiment was observed for about a week before Miller and Urey started to notice something very peculiar. The water mixture was turning pink after only a week, and later on became a darker brown color. The water was tested on a weekly basis to determine what changes, if any, were occurring. Non-organic compounds were turning into 25 different amino acids, various sugars, and proteins. Amino acids are the basic building blocks of RNA and DNA, the information that drives evolution and life. These were simple chemical reactions that were yielding incredible results. These compounds explain the change in color. Now, this experiment and all the others that came after it didn't prove, without a shadow of a doubt, that life began in a murky pond, but they did provide proof of concept. They provide evidence of the fact that, given the right elements, the right temperatures, and the right conditions, the building blocks of life can be formed without the need for divine intervention right here on planet Earth. The sample vials from Miller Urey are still available for observation. Third, the lack of reliable testimony. I've been a student of religion since I was the age of 13. I've read the Bible a dozen times or more and studied it in depth, including the Nag Hammadi library and all the available Gnostic texts. I've read and studied the Quran, numerous occult texts, ancient texts, the Book of Mormon, bits of the Urantia book, the Vedas, Dianetics, and many more that I can't even remember and that most people have never even heard of. Each of these texts have two things in common. First, they all claim to contain testimony of God, or at least to answer the question of God in some ultimate way. Second, each of these texts are incredibly and equally unreliable in their testimonies of the deities or theological ideas they claim. From the Bible's spurious and not to mention brutal record of the history of the Jews and the life of Jesus Christ, which doesn't line up with any extra biblical accounts, to the testimony of Muhammad's receiving of the words in the Quran when they conveniently lined up with the needs of his lifestyle. None of these allegedly holy texts provide us with any good reason to believe that what they purport is actually true. I think it's reasonable to assert that if God did exist and was omnipresent, omnipotent, and omniscient, as most holy texts claim, he would be able to provide for and maintain a reliable testimony that would last through the ages so that mankind would have some strong reason to believe, rather than leaving us with these texts which do nothing but leave us with good reasons to doubt. Third, refuting Column. One of the common arguments for the necessity of God to have created the universe is called Column's cosmological argument. You just heard Mr. Snow use it. It states that everything that has a beginning has a cause, the universe has a beginning, and therefore the universe has a cause. The problem with this argument is that it assumes something special about an actor which cannot be known by any testable means. It assumes that the Creator, God, has always existed and is infinite. This is called special pleading. It's what happens when you apply a special set of circumstances or principles to an individual in order to make a case more solid. But what it does, in fact, is destroys the case in its own right because it's created a logical fallacy by requiring that special rules be made for the special actor. Here's another quick and easy rebuttal for Column's argument assuming God's existence. 1, God understands the laws of logic as the creator of all things. 2, God understands that breaking the laws of logic he created will cause man to doubt his existence. Therefore, God's existence requires that he created us in a way that was illogical and that doubt was the only reasonable conclusion. In conclusion, I cannot prove that there is no God somewhere out there. My opponent nor any of his contemporaries are able to provide the opposite. That's kind of where you have to stand when it comes to this debate. You have to recognize, no matter what your experiences are or were, that you cannot prove your position. You can only provide some relational probability to anyone that enters the arena. So, God or no God, which explains reality. Both of us have the job of providing a level of probability for our respective sides. For me, God is entirely improbable. That probability shrinks every day as science expands and diminishes the necessity for God. You see, a few hundred years ago, it was almost unreasonable not to believe, but we didn't know then what we know now. We didn't know that the universe was as expansive as it is, or that the sun was the center of the solar system, or even that the earth was round and spinning. We didn't know that the earth was 14 plus billion years old, and that humans had made their appearance in the phylogenetic tree about 150,000 years ago. We didn't know that the building blocks of life were available in the atmosphere of the hot and tumultuous planet that was Earth some 4 or 5 billion years ago, when life is believed to have started its incredible journey into what we know today. Through amazing feats of observable science, however, today we know all these things and we can prove them. Before these things were known, it seemed like a good idea to assume that the unexplainable could only be explained in one way. God did it. There were very few people in the world who dared question that idea, who dared look for reasons rather than settle for simple answers to the most difficult questions we faced. Many of them were persecuted, imprisoned, or even killed by those who claimed to speak for the God who was the easily assumed answer to the questions they were asking. But the thirst for real knowledge is not so easily quenched, and their legacy lives on in scientific endeavor today. Notice that I'm not claiming the knowledge that no God exists. Most atheists don't hold that position, and I don't either. In order to make such a broad and sweeping claim, I'd have to lay claim to an infinite amount of knowledge. And I think it's clear that I'm not privy to anything near that. I'm claiming that God is unnecessary, unlikely, and most of all, entirely unprovable as a concept. And since I'm not making any claims about the existence of God, the absolute burden of proof for any claim to its existence lies with the one making the claim. While God may be an easy answer, God is not a relevant or pursuable answer. God says, or the Quran says, or the Bible says, are on equal footing when it comes to the questions where evidence is needed. And so, in the gaps where God once sat, truth eventually began to take its rightful place. The world is no longer flat and no longer the center of the universe or our own solar system. In fact, it's merely a pale blue dot in an ocean consisting mostly of emptiness. It wasn't God's decree or church authority that made this so, and it wasn't even scientific discovery. It was always the case. Science just unlocked our ability to know it. God has never unlocked our ability to know anything that we didn't know before, at least not anything that was later verified and then peer-reviewed. The earth is no longer believed to be 6,000 years old by the majority of the population, but instead it's billions in years of age. Life has existed on it for hundreds of millions of years, slowly evolving into what we know today. Not because God has made it so, or because the Southern Baptist Convention voted on it, not even because a consensus has been reached in the respective scientific communities that research and study these things. The earth wasn't young when most of the population believed it. It won't be if most of you believe it today. The evidence says otherwise. And the evidence to science is what drives our understanding of the truth. God has no grasp on evidence and no place in a discussion on evidence because there simply is no evidence for God. 2. God does not explain reality. God is an enemy of reality and of exploration and of inquiry. God is an easy answer in a reality where questions are fundamentally the most important part of our search for whatever is ultimately true. We don't need easy answers. What we need are hard questions, and minds willing to seek the ends of those questions wherever the evidence leads them. Now, I'm going to try to run over a couple of things in the little bit of time I have that Rip brought up before we get into rebuttals that I haven't hit first, and just let me know when I hit that time. Rip mentioned that morality is inexplainable or relative if we don't have a God to guide us. And I find that even if morality is objective, it still tends to work. We actually can exist in a society today. There are 2 rows of godless heathens right here in front of me, and none of them have ever hurt one another at all. They would always do good for one another and for anyone else in this room. Why? Not because they see a value given to them by God, but they see a value in each one of you by you being a human. And that's enough. That's enough for every one of us as humanists and as atheists, as people that are just reasonable. And that's probably all I have time for. Thank you.
Rip is going to have 10 minutes to rebut Matt's opening presentation. Can you hear me when I tell you 5 minutes? Can you hear me? Yeah, 5 seconds. Okay. You ready?
Yes.
Good.
Well, the first thing I've got to say is this idea somehow that science has pushed God out of the gaps that were formerly reserved for him is just absolutely flawed. As a matter of fact, were it not for the fact that God's existence was presupposed by the first scientists we had, Kepler, Copernicus, Newton, and the rest of the mob, there would be no science. As a matter of fact, to this day, we still presuppose theistic underpinnings to all of science. Science cannot be done without theistic presuppositional application to ourselves. For instance, we all believe we're here. We all believe that there are other people in this room. We accept the concrete reality around us. All of these elements are theistic in their underpinning. Why? Because the original scientists saw it as their work, as was said, to rethink God's thoughts after him. They were looking at a universe that was intelligible. I don't know if you've ever considered it for yourselves. The Kalam argument, which was misstated, I don't know if you ever consider for yourself this. Why is it that as we look at the reality we have, these chairs, this room, the air around us, the molecules that we're breathing and exhaling, why should we understand any of that? Why should the atoms that float about inside between my ears correspond to the realities out there? In other words, why should I be able to describe this reality in the language of mathematics? Because there's an intelligence behind the reality to give it that meaning. We couldn't discern it. For instance, if all we are is, as Matt described us and as Hawking described us, moist clockwork, if that's all we are, why should anything that I empirically verify with my 5 senses, why should I trust it? It works now, but it might not. And I've no way to verify the truth claim that's made for it there. He said also that morality is relative without God. He said, I said that. I did not say that. What I said is that human value is relative without God, and I defy anybody to tell me how you can get around that. Human value is only conferred. Get a nation big enough, get a nation with a big enough army and a big enough police force, they will decide what you and I are worth. And you and I will be able to say nothing or do nothing about it. And any plea we might make to the humanity of it all will be dismissed by the fact that you and I might fall into that group who are no longer seen as human, and there will be nobody to come to your defense. That is why without God, there is no objective value whatsoever for the human being. We may think we have it. We're in this air-conditioned room. We're in this free country. We've got plenty of food. All of us drove over here in our own personal projectiles at a high speed that would have been unheard of 150 years ago. We live in homes that are probably air-conditioned. We have refrigerators. We open the doors, and there it is. That's why we can stand back from the reality we see and throw rocks at it, because we have that luxury. There are places where they don't. And I promise you, some of those places where people do not have the luxury to stand back and throw rocks at reality are begging God for help, and sometimes he provides it. Now, as far as some of the other things he mentioned here, the law of non-contradiction, I completely agree with. Our physical senses, how can empiricism ever define human worth? How can it? When the only thing we have then is humans telling humans what they're worth. Life from non-life. He said that there's some scientists got together, and I've read the articles, I've read the reports, very familiar with it. My question is, just like the old joke, and you've probably heard it, scientist comes into the throne room, if God sits on the throne, and the Bible describes it that way, so we'll say it just for imagery, for the sake of this evening. Runs in and says, I've made life, and God says, that is awesome. God says, let's do the experiment again. Scientist says, I'm there, man. I've got it together. Scientist says, okay, so God reaches down and picks up a handful of dirt, and the scientist reaches down and picks up a handful of dirt, and God says, you're going to have to make your own dirt. I'm telling you, this science, the fact that scientists can take glass test tubes in a controlled environment, inject certain chemicals in certain quantities, in certain ratios to each other, and get it to turn colors because amino acids are developed. Look here, the amino acids are the smallest part of the building block. The arrangement of the amino acids is so precise that the way that the DNA molecule is assembled for the amino acids to line up to produce proteins which produce the building blocks of the DNA molecule, 1 times 10 to the 80th power. That's a big deal. That's a big deal. As far as science expanding and pushing God out of the gaps, yes, there was a time in prehistory when people did believe that lightning was God's thunderbolts and the thunder was his angry voice. We do know more than we knew then. But where is science going to answer the question as to what happens to us when we leave this world? Because there's only one, so far as we know, who came back to tell us what it's like. How is science going to answer that question? And I promise you, every person in this room faces that point. At some point in their lives, they will face it. And yes, for the humanists who are here, you are exactly right. And that is exactly right, to point out the fact that it is good enough, just because we are human beings, that we would deign to do good things for somebody else. But I'll tell you, it comes from a different source altogether. When we as human beings do something good in that way, when we help somebody who needs our help, when we give to someone who needs us to give, when we sacrifice of ourselves in order that someone else, their life is made better, all we are doing is reflecting the image of God back to him, whether we know it or not. So the humanist is correct. The human being is worth serving for the sake of. They are. But it comes from a different source, their worth does. And I promise you, all you've got to do, when I pointed out in my first speech, that if we decide as a nation of people that 3-year-olds, under 3 years old, if a person is handicapped mentally and physically, and we decide that their worth is such that we can do away with them so that the rest of us who are healthy and are the right kind of people can flourish. And if we decide that a certain ethnicities, we are allowed to view them as non-human and work them to death, we can decide that, and there's nobody to call that into question for them. No humanist is going to step into that fray. Not on that business, not for that sake, and the reason is they will have nowhere to turn. Because the culture has decided empirically what those people are worth. Now this idea of the science and the test tubes and all of this, one thing you didn't point out, yes, they did get biological material. The biological material did not replicate, and it hasn't yet. And that's been going on since the 60s. I read of the experiments that were being done when I was in high school. I'm 56. They've not done it yet. They've not gotten anything to replicate. There's a reason for that. The reason it won't replicate is there's no information installed there to make it replicate. For it to replicate, you've got to have a replicator. Life doesn't emerge from chemistry without some information to begin it. And that information is within that code. And if the code is not there, no replication takes place. It just becomes random. and randomness doesn't produce anything at all. As a matter of fact, and I close with this, randomness will always destroy what it creates. Did you know that? We've had I believe the numbers, 4.25 billion years on this earth that the earth has been here. That's a long time. Randomness will always destroy what it creates. If you take infinitely a box of alphabets and throw them in the air, if you're supplied infinitely, eventually you'll get one of Shakespeare's sonatas. As soon as you pick them up off the ground, they're gone. And that process is ongoing, and if the process is ongoing, there is nothing to stop the replication from ceasing. It seems to me to make a whole lot more sense that there's some intelligence behind all this, and that person I call God.
Matt will have 10 minutes for his rebuttal.
Thank you. First of all, I didn't intend to misquote you, but I think I got the spirit of what you were going for, at the very least, on your moral quote. You mentioned that God has been presupposed by science, and that would actually be a bad way to approach science. Anytime you presuppose something in science, you have to go back and re-examine that science because it's not actually science when you presuppose something. You have to then re-examine it and your method, or you don't have science. If you presuppose, one, that there is some massive actor outside of whatever you're doing in your experiment, then what you have is actually just a big assumption and some magic being, God, that is making things happen. So presupposing that is really not science at all. It's really poor science, if anything. Maybe creation science or intelligent design, but it isn't science. It doesn't fit that definition by any means. That's something that belongs at the Institution for Creation Research, and I hope we aren't there. You said that reality corresponding to our senses is evidence of God. And if I do misquote you, please just kind of wave your finger at me. But I was trying to write really quickly. I don't know how exactly that works. Perhaps I don't know what it would look like if reality did not correspond to our senses. If it didn't correspond to our senses, then we probably wouldn't be having this discussion and it would be completely moot. However, we have to assume that it does, because we wouldn't be able to have this conversation any other way. Either way, I think to say that it is proof of God or evidence of God is a dream, a desire, and is not any actual evidence of such. There is no actual evidence being presented in that, just a desire for that to be the case. You also mentioned, you kind of jumped around a little bit, so it's kind of hard to follow here, so my notes are a little mixed up. Human value is best defined by God, no objective value without God. Objective value is not necessary for there still to be value. I hate to do what everyone does and bring up Hitler, but Hitler had a terrible value for other people. We're in the Deep South, so let's actually talk about the Deep South for a moment. The Deep South looked at African Americans for hundreds of years in such a way, and actually all of America, I can say this about all of America, as 1/3 of a human. Now, that wasn't humanism driving that. That was actually an understanding of the Bible, the way they believed it, and their interpretation of it, and that wasn't atheism. That wasn't humanism. That was nothing but a biblical view, and probably humans leading it the way they wanted it to go. I'm sure of that. But that wasn't us driving that. And there's nothing objective about that. But will you stand behind that? Surely not. I know you won't, because you're a better man than that. So, sure, yeah, you don't have to have an objective value, but the Bible doesn't provide any better objective value. In fact, the Bible and God show that women are 1/3 a man. I don't believe that. I believe that a woman is one full person, and that man next to my wife is one full person. And so my value for people is just as good as every other person. Every person is worth one full person to me. If you believe differently than that, that's fine. You'll have to make an argument, and we'll have to discuss that. So no, it may not be completely objective. We may not be able to establish rules around that. But nonetheless, we'll have a better value of humans than if we follow the Bible. I do believe. I think history has shown us that. You said, how can empiricism define human value, human worth, or our morals? I don't know if that empiricism is the way. Well, actually, I think it is. Empathy is a form of empiricism where someone does something terrible to me, I don't want it done to someone else, or I don't want bad things to happen to me. Jesus talked about this, golden rule, do unto others. It seemed to be good enough for him. It's good enough for me. I don't want to treat people poorly because I don't want to be treated poorly. Some of us are even better than that, and we just don't treat people poorly at all, not for any selfish motivation. You did simplify Miller-Urey and kind of misstated what the point of it was. The point of Miller-Urey was to determine whether or not there could be organic proteins and materials from non-organic proteins. That, in fact, was proven. That gave us something to build on, a theory of abiogenesis. And from that, we had a pretty good theory. You said 10 to the 80th power was the likelihood that those proteins could ever combine and then begin to replicate. Well, to a certain degree, that's true. In a large enough pond, 10 to the 80th power is nothing. That is a very, very small number in a big lottery. Let's look at the lottery. Let's say you sell 10 trillion tickets, but the odds are 10 trillion to 1. Someone's probably going to win, and someone might even share their money. That's how replication works, and that's how likelihood and genes work. Someone wins, and it's wonderful, and evolution works in the same way. You talked a little bit about brinksmanship when you were talking about the value of humans again, and you kind of jumped around. I'm having a hard time here. But you mentioned this fear that people would be devalued at some point, and I think that's probably well-founded to a degree. I don't think that's ever happened as a result of viewing life with a humanist viewpoint. I think it's always been at the hands of people that viewed themselves as better than others, or that viewed their beliefs as better than others, or as some people as sinners. Because the Bible says that everyone in this place is a sinner. It doesn't say that everyone here is capable of doing wonderful things. It doesn't say that everyone here is capable of doing the greatest good. And I believe that about everyone here. But the Bible says that you are all sinners, bound to hell if you don't believe the right thing. And I believe more about you than that. I believe you're better than that. And I hope I'm right. But that's all I've got for right now.
At this time, we're going to shift gears just a little bit, and each of the participants are going to man their respective mics and have an opportunity to ask each other questions. Now, we do want to keep your answers to 1 to 2 minutes max. This is going to be a 15-minute timed.
Okay.
Yeah. And so we'll start with you, Rip.
All right. How in the world, from the humanist perspective, from a materialist perspective, do you ever come to explain consciousness, real consciousness, that we all possess?
Evolution actually explains consciousness quite well. I am not an evolutionary biologist. Let me just say that. It's very important that you know that.
Neither am I.
Okay, good. So even if I could explain it, you probably wouldn't understand it, and no one else would here either. And I probably can't either. We'd probably have to get one of my good friends, Dr. Rich Saplita, in here to get that figured out for us. Over time, brains become more complex. They develop social structures, or the need, or that's a hard one to explain. It is a hard one to explain, but it comes out of a social ingenuity. And when social structures become a part of the brain that is more dominant, then that begins to self-select in nature. Now, natural selection chooses that, and we kind of came out of that from our primate relatives. You may not believe that, but our primate relatives were very social creatures, and the more social they were, the more likely they were to be selected, and then from them we came. So, and morality is a result of that.
What would be your response to that question?
Well, clearly that's not the case at all. I mean, evolution can't ever produce the I-ness of consciousness within that context, because in the end, if evolution, and I'm not denying it or affirming it, I'm simply saying if evolution by gradual processes, we came to the place where we were self-aware, that self-awareness would have no grounding, that it couldn't just lie to us. In other words, if I thought to myself, well, I like big things, and there are really only 4 reasons for self-awareness to come to us. That's so that it can flee, fight, feed, and reproduce. That's what evolution tells us. Those are the impeti behind evolution. So, in that case, then it might just completely lie to me. So I might look at big things and see small things and run toward them, and then, of course, my line would die out. But it might create a survival for me, which means that even if it lies to me and creates survival, then my line goes on believing wrong things, which is what I'm saying here. That's why I said science has to presuppose reality in a certain context, which is the context in which we receive it. You can't have that kind of presupposition without a theistic base for it, because there's no intelligibility there whatsoever.
Thank you. Matt?
Well,
You want to respond, or you want to ask a
Yeah, I'd like to respond to that real quick.
Okay,
Yeah,
here we go.
If that were the case, you wouldn't be here because your line, the genetic line that you have, would have all died out.
Not necessarily.
Well, yeah, necessarily,
No,
because
not
you
at
would have
all.
been running toward big saber-toothed cats and trying to hug them.
Correct, but if the big
Bad
thing,
idea.
you didn't understand what I said. I said if I saw big things as small and small things as big, my senses are lying to me, but they keep me alive anyway. That's why I'm saying you can't do science without a presupposition underneath it, and the presupposition is we are getting accurate information from our senses.
Right.
And you cannot have that without intelligibility within the universe, and the atoms aren't intelligible. Why do they obey the laws they do without a theistic underpinning? I don't see how, and I don't see why I should understand them either.
Would you like to respond, or do you want to ask a question?
I'm going to ask a question, but it's going to be on the same lines. Why exactly does presupposing science have to have a theistic underpinning at all? What makes it theistic?
It doesn't have to have a theistic underpinning. What it has to have is an underpinning of presupposition toward consciousness and the value of it. And you can't have that without a theistic underpinning, because just what I just said, if I decide that my senses tell me that I'm not 4 feet off the ground, and I walk off and I crash and burn, then my senses are going to end my line, correct? If I get it wrong all the time, then my line dies out. But what if I get it wrong and this is a flat plane and I perceive it as 4 feet off the ground, and I walk places that I cannot be hurt, but my senses are lying to me? So when I do math, when I do anything about an observational apprehension of the universe, then all I'm going to get are lies back, even though those lies keep me alive.
So again, where's God in that, though? How does that...
The fact that the universe is intelligible to us, that we can take mathematics and apply them to reality, that we can describe the movement of physical bodies via mathematics.
Where's God in that? I'm still not seeing God in that.
Because the science has to be presupposed to be attainable by us. There has to be an intelligence behind the universe, or otherwise it's just all random movements. We have no place to plug it in to any sense of it means something. We could detect patterns, but that's about it.
Okay, I'm not seeing God in that. Is it May's turn now?
Well, you asked a question, yes. Let's change.
Is it my turn to ask a question? Okay.
We're at about 9.5 minutes left.
Okay, you said something about slavery and women in the Bible. It was simply not the case. The Bible does not endorse slavery, number one. It does not. Not slavery in the sense that we understand it. Slavery was an uncontroversial enterprise up until about 300 years ago. In the whole of the world, it was uncontroversial. The first anti-slavery movements in this country and in Europe were all theistic. They were Christians, as a matter of fact.
Yes, I
question.
agree.
Okay. So, and the same with women. As a matter of fact, Paul, a rabbi, You may not know the rabbinic prayer that was spoken prior to the first century, yes. I'm glad, Yahweh, you didn't make me a female, a Jew, or a Gentile. Paul takes that and turns it upside down and says, we're all one in Christ Jesus. There's neither male nor female, Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, we're all one. Why would you then accuse the Bible of endorsing slavery when it does not? It's the very impetus that ended it.
The Bible has a couple more pages than that one. There's an Old Testament.
I'm aware of it.
Yeah, that one has some rough areas. Talks about the destruction of the Amalekites. There are slaves. There are laws in Leviticus that determine when and how you can sell a slave or even sell your daughter. I don't need to tell you where they're at, and I can't remember right off the bat, but you know they're there, and most of the people in the audience know they're there. It's there, and whether or not that was a controversial enterprise doesn't really make it a good enterprise.
Well, I would agree with that.
So if it was an enterprise, if it was endorsed by the Bible, if it was something that had laws determining how and when it should be okay to have slaves and sell your daughter, why is this an okay book for us to live our lives by?
First of all, you make several category mistakes. Number one, you assume that our morality comes from the Bible. It does not. Our morality comes from the fact that we're made in the image of God, which places within every human being an intrinsic infinite value as being God's creation. That's number one. Number two, nobody in this room, I guarantee you, reads those Old Testament Levitical passages in the way you describe them. Nobody in this room would sell their daughter who is a Christian. All right, the reason that that's there is because God has not just come in and swept all things aside. He comes into the cultures where we are, speaks to us through who we are in that moment. At that moment in history, if you go back and read the Code of Hammurabi, you see what they did with slaves there. All right, the Jews came along, and God said in 7 years, you got to let them go. And if a slave comes from another country and comes into your country for refuge, you're not to treat them as a slave. You are to give them the refuge and treat them as one of your own. So it was a radical change. And if God had come into the Roman Empire at the time of Jesus and undone slavery, the entire economy of the Roman Empire would have collapsed, because the whole economy was built on slavery. 49% of the economy was nothing but the labor of slaves in that milieu. So that, for me, is sufficient reason to say the Bible does not endorse slavery in the way you describe it, and it has been the impetus to end it. It's been the impetus to end discrimination. It's been the impetus for everything that you and I would agree are humanistic reasons to treat each other well.
Before Rip asks his next question, would you like 30 seconds to respond to that?
I just want to make it clear that you're saying that it's quite all right, the Bible is quite all right with slavery and on the short term so that it doesn't collapse an economy before people?
They were people. Those were people. The economy was the people. You understand that money is nothing but congealed life. I mean, you and I live there as well, right?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, so if Jesus had come on the scene and said, I'm going to pass a decree that ends all slavery, it would have ruined the entirety of the Roman Empire at that time, and nothing of what you and I expect as civilization would be.
Okay.
Because the economy was built on slavery.
Okay, I would think that would be a good time for a miracle or something.
Actually, Rip's your turn to ask a question.
Okay. You said that you look at empathy as the best reason in order to, and by the way, the miracle comment again, God doesn't work that way with anybody. He does not enforce, he does not assume to overrun all of humanity. That's why I'm here. If he had overrun me, yeah, I might believe, but I wouldn't like him very much. Empathy as a reason to treat people fairly, it only works as long as the empathy extended is real empathy. And we're the only ones who can decide what that is. There is no place that you and I can point and say, that's empathy. As a matter of fact, if you go back in the Greek philosophers, they disdained empathy. Aristotle looked at it with scorn, compassion, empathy. He looked at magnanimity. So where are we going to find some place to ground that empathy if we as a culture decide that the empathy that we extend is actually harmful to people?
If we're extending harmful empathy, I think that we'll tend to revolt against it naturally. That seems to be the case anytime that two or more people are hurt in a certain way. Now, there is a certain thing called a mob mentality that does end up turning over empathy. We saw that, with the treatment of the Jews and the Holocaust and all that, of course. But that wasn't an empathetic society. That was empathy on its head. So I don't see how you're saying that empathy doesn't work, because it clearly, if you treat a person the way that you would like to be treated, so long as the way you want to be treated is reasonably kind, and I think that's the case with most of us. 99% of us want to be treated well. There are a few of us that are a little weird. We want to be treated differently. Now, I'm not going to tell you that's not okay, but find a way to do that without harming anybody else, and we'll be okay. Now, anyone that does not meet that definition of empathy or empathetic behavior is probably going to be labeled a psychopath. Now, we have textbook definitions of that, and that's why we have the DSM-5, and we deal with that on a psychological level. We have institutions for people like that, so we'll just send them to an institution when they're a danger to society and their empathy, medulla oblongata, and all those empathy sectors are broken. So yeah, you can be a broken person, you can be a messed up person and not have the right employed empathy, sure. But for the most part, for most of us in here, it probably works. Probably for everyone in here.
Oh, I would agree with you. It works for everyone.
Let him, we're running out of time, so
Okay.
I'm going to let Matt ask the last question and you respond.
All right.
I don't have a question.
Think of one fast.
We could go with that exchange if
But
you
yeah,
want.
you want to just continue on to give Rip a chance to reply?
Give me a second. Yeah, if you want to reply, go ahead, Rip.
Yeah, the empathy only works until somebody says, so what, or says who. And then the empathy evaporates. If there's no place to ground that empathy, then empathy becomes a word we just used that has no meaning. It might mean one thing to another person, two or three things to another crowd, and like you said with the mob mentality, yeah, that's exactly the case. And there's no place to shut that down because there's nobody within that mob who could rise up and say this is wrong. We're looking at what's happening in northern Iraq right now. Those people have empathy for each other. They have no empathy for the 6-year-olds that they're sawing their heads off. So I'm just saying that you can talk about empathy and paint it as this wonderful, warm, fuzzy place where we can all just get along. And I'm telling you, there's something in the human heart that says no. If I question empathy, then the empathy evaporates. And all it takes is a question, why? Why should I be empathetic? And in a universe where there's nobody to call it into question, who's going to say?
Yeah, 1 minute left. You can have the last word.
Okay, clearly we're not perfect. I'm not saying that, and I'm not saying that any person with any access to an empathetic type of approach to life is going to be a perfect application of that. That should be clear. Trying to apply the Bible to life has clearly been a failed experiment. So I think that trying to say that empathy has not worked, when by and large it has, in day-to-day life it has. When we had a conversation earlier today, it worked really well. When I go out and shake people's hand today, it's going to work great. It works on a day-to-day basis, and by and large in society it works great. There are times when it will fail. And we have methods in place. Our society now is built on empathy and bureaucracy, so why not allow it to continue working? I mean, that's what we're basing this whole life and this American way of life on right now, is treat people the way you want to be treated. Really, that's simple. Jesus was cool with it. That's really what it boils down to. Jesus was cool with it, and he didn't say anything about God planting that in your heart at that time.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. While they're going to sit down and collect their thoughts and make their closing statements in just a minute. This will be a 10-minute timed for each one.
I'm still just going to take a lot of time.
You good? Okay, one second. Excuse me. Are you hearing me when I tell you 5 minutes too?
Yes, I'm good with it.
All right. Begin.
Well, I would say that you and I are here this evening asking what I consider to be the biggest question of all. Does the existence of God better explain reality? And if it does it matter? I want to just stop for just a few minutes. We've argued back and forth about a lot of things. I want to step away from it for just a moment and make it human. I remember when I was a child, I had an intuitive thought when my father would put me to bed and the lights would go out. I remember lying there, and of course, once the lights go out, the only thing you have are your thoughts. And I remember thinking to myself, I would go on. In other words, I'd been to funerals, I'd seen people die, but somehow for me, that seemed like a complete unreality. And I'm going to say that most of us in this room, if we really are able to get in touch with ourselves, we realize that in ourselves, it's hard for us to imagine non-being. C.S. Lewis says it very well, this idea of death not having the last word. He says it this way, and he says it from a purely human standpoint, so follow this if you would. He says, I recognize within myself desires and appetites for real satisfactions that are really there. There's a way to satisfy these desires and these appetites. He says, I find within myself the feeling of hunger. And so I go into the kitchen, I prepare a plate of food, I sit down, I find that satisfaction met. It's a real desire met by a real satisfaction. He says, then I find myself while I'm eating, perhaps I grow thirsty. So I go and I pour myself a glass of something to drink, and in that I find a real desire met by a real satisfaction. Then he says, I might find within myself a kind of an immaterial desire. The immaterial desire would be that of satisfying my desire to end a loneliness within myself. He says, so I go and meet with some friends, and I find that immaterial desire satisfied by very real things. 3 different satisfactions met by real things. He says, but then what do? I find within myself a desire for a satisfaction for which there is no satisfaction in this world. Do I then just infer automatically? And C.S. Lewis was an atheist prior to becoming a believer, which is generally the track. He says, do I then think that that desire, which cannot be met by any satisfaction in this world, is an unreal one? Or do I presuppose perhaps that I was made for another world? H.L. Mencken, Henry Louis Mencken, died in 1956, and he was the Christopher Hitchens of his day. I don't know if any of you have read Christopher Hitchens, extremely gifted writer, extremely gifted intellect, who died just a few years ago. And Mencken was like Hitchens. He had this incredible intellect. Well, Mencken was also an atheist, and he was vocally so. He called himself an agnostic, but I must say, I've known many agnostics in my life. I have no respect for the position because every agnostic I've ever known has lived as though they were absolutely sure that God doesn't exist, which is what the word agnostic means. I don't know. Well, all of them I've ever met were certain. Mencken came to the end of his life, and he said, look, he told his friends, he said, now I'm going to have a funeral like everybody else, but I've got some requests. I do not want anybody to come up and preach some sermon about the by and by when I die. I do not want any hymns sung from the prayer books and the hymnals. I do not want anybody to come and read from any holy book because I respect none of them. I just want people to come and remember me for who I was. And he got what he wanted. But some friends of his came to him and they said, Henry, you know, before you die, we just got to ask you the question, what if you're wrong? I mean, what if you die and everything you thought about God not being there turns out to be wrong? What are you going to do? Bertrand Russell, an atheist, a hugely massive intellect, mathematician and philosopher from the last century, asked the very same question. He was asked that question when he came to the end of his life, and he said, well, I'll just stand up in front of God and say, you simply didn't give me sufficient evidence. Mencken said exactly the same thing, although he added this. He said, and then I'll say, but it seems I was wrong. Now, I just got to say, I want to stop the clock and say, is that a rational way for anybody to think? Is it rational to believe that it's okay that you and I, mortal, finite human beings, that if we die and we find out he really is there, that we are going to marshal an argument that's going to make it okay that we dissed him our whole lives? I don't think so. There was another great intellect in the 17th century, a mathematician by the name of Blaise Pascal. I know everybody in this room, whether atheist or believers, probably heard this, so sorry about that. I'm going to paraphrase it and point to something in it that you may not have considered. Blaise Pascal became a Christian at 31 years of age by the proddings of his sister, who was a Christian. He was so changed by this that he carried a little notebook in his jacket pocket from then on. He only lived another 8 years till he was 39. And he wrote down his reflections on this world that was so radically different to him now because of this change in his life. The sting of death had been removed for him, and it changed everything. So he wrote it down. It's called his Pensées. He didn't finish it because he was writing them when he died. We have that collection now. And one of them goes this way. I know you've heard this, but bear with me. He said, if a person should live their entire life believing that God exists, and in that belief find a relationship with this God they believe to be there, and in that relationship find the sting of death removed, and in finding the sting of death removed, find peace with their fellow human being, peace within themselves, peace with the world, and a peaceful life lived, and then they die and find out they were wrong. I'm going to paraphrase Blaise, if I could be so brazen. Potting soil does not regret. Potting soil doesn't regret, but he says if a person should live their entire life believing that God is not there and living with the sting of death not removed, losing the sense of peace that could be had in this world, that we're not just that we're committing ourselves to the great perhaps, and then they die and find out they were wrong and God is there, they've not only lost the peace they could have had here, but they've lost eternity, and there's no hope for recovery. It's not a bet to be hedged. It's not fire insurance. What it is saying, right here, right now, which is better? Do I want to go through this life with nothing but darkness and nothingness at the end of it, or do I want to go through this life thinking and believing that there's a relationship with one who actually will give me eternal life if I'll come in the way that he asks? You see, the life produced when death has no sting, the big question is satisfied. G.K. said it well. He said, for the Christian, suffering is peripheral, joy is central. For the non-Christian, suffering is central because all we want to do is avoid it. Joy is peripheral because we're always chasing it. For the Christian, that question is satisfied. And that question comes to us in a way that God has provided for us all. Yes, the death of Jesus on the cross, a real historical event in time and space, verified by at least 12 non-biblical sources and the Gospels themselves. There's a word we use, skeptistia. It means to view from a distance. Science, questions, philosophy, all these things, our reason can only take us so close. Skeptistia is that view from a distance. We need some help in order to step in and come near. God has given us that help in the death and the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. You've heard all the arguments this evening. You, each one, will have to adjudicate for yourselves. Thank you very much.
And now Matt will have 10 minutes for his closing statement.
Thank you. First of all, I think whether or not you agree with where I'm coming from, you may agree that Rip did fail to provide any actual evidence for his argument. He did provide us with a lot of I wishes and I wants, and even a presuppositional argument that doesn't really make any sense, I'm sorry to say. He's given us a lot of things that he wants to believe. He wants to be true. I want to live forever too. I would love to. That would be wonderful. I know most of you here would like that, atheists and non-atheists alike. We chase life, in fact. We try to live as long as we can, unless you're fat like me and you're trying to kill yourself. It is hard to imagine non-being, but that doesn't mean anything. Those words mean nothing in relation to whether or not God exists. They don't answer the question. Does God explain reality? No, but I sure do not want to think about not existing. Well, what does that give us? Not much. That doesn't give us any evidence, and that's what I'm looking for. I was really surprised that Rip brought up Pascal. Pascal is the one thing we all hear. Every atheist in this room has heard it 1,000,000 times over. And I couldn't believe, because I know Rip is above that, shame on you, is above that argument. So I'm going to counter it right now. And generally, you don't bring up new evidence in the rebuttal or in the closing statements of a debate, but I have to because this is a new argument, so I just have to. It's against any rules of debate. It is against the rules, but I'm going to. What if I'm wrong? You can be wrong too. Allah could be just as right as you believe God is. The Wiccan gods could be right. The Native American gods could be true. Pascal didn't think about the thousands of other gods that are claimed to have existed in the many different holy books and legends that have been passed down through generations of humankind. What if you're wrong? Have you considered any of those beliefs? I know Rip has to a degree. I don't know if he's considered them seriously. But have you considered the fact that you may in fact be wrong about what you believe? I know I have. I wrestled with this. I wrestled with my lack of belief. I begged God to take it away, in fact. And he didn't. Largely because he isn't there to do so. So what if you're wrong? If I'm wrong, you could be too. Our odds are about the same. And that's unfortunate for any of us if Cthulhu is coming from the ocean. He shows no mercy, if you don't know. Another thing that Rip brought up in his closing statement is that there are 12 non-biblical sources for the testimony of Jesus Christ. That is what I caught you saying? Okay. I have dropped 2 pens already. Those extra-biblical sources all occur after Jesus allegedly died. The first one was born in 30 CE, and so he was an infant at the alleged death of Jesus Christ. He is in no way possibly an eyewitness to Christ. That's the earliest. There are no extra biblical sources that can be trusted that provide testimony of Jesus Christ or the story around him. I'm not here to tell you that Jesus didn't exist, but that story cannot be verified in any way. In closing, I do want to say a few things, a few kind words. I have found that Tyler and Dana, who put this together, have been incredible hosts. I found that Rip is a wonderfully intelligent man. We sat down for a good hour and a half today and just had a great talk. We agree on a lot more than we disagree. That's what I find with most believers. And I enjoy talking with them. I enjoyed this debate that we fervently disagree about, this subject. But in the end, we do agree on one thing. We are human and we have to learn to communicate and vehemently disagree when we must. But the conversation is important, and it's important that you think about the implications of what you believe and understand why you believe what you believe. Okay. And again, that's really all I have. I don't believe we were given any evidence, anything really radical to think about, and that's what we're looking for. If you're looking for that, remember what you didn't get here. What you needed was evidence. You didn't get it. I have a place for you. That's all. Thank you.
At this time, we're going to raise the house lights. We are going to invite you to bring your questions to the presenters. Be thinking about your questions now. If you would start making your way and form a line at each of these mics, there'll be an usher there to help you. I would ask that you keep your questions to a maximum of 1 minute. Don't take all day long to form the question. And if you start going too long, we'll just ask you to get to it or move on. We would also ask that you direct your question to a particular presenter, and I would ask each of you as presenters to keep your responses to to 2 minutes, okay? Do we have an usher? Okay, Ronnie, yes, right here. All right, so we'll start on, right here with you. Who's your question for?
For Matt, correct?
Yes, sir. Elder?
Yes. My question is based off of the scientific method, and I apologize if this comes out of kind of a biased view of God existing, but at the argument of the presupposed, wouldn't the scientific method be based off of a hypothesis being something that would be presupposed?
Yes, we do presuppose certain things within science. That is normal. We presuppose that what we find whenever we do an experiment is true. We assume that what we see happen is true. We are assuming that our senses are correct. If that is incorrect, if we are wrong about that, then all of science falls apart. This place has not fallen down yet, though, so we're pretty good, thankfully.
All right, thank you.
No problem, thank you.
Did we get to respond?
I think so.
If you would like to respond to that.
Just to say, you're exactly right when you say we presuppose things in science. We go further than that. The actual explanations for the existence of the universe without God in the paradigm, all of those explanations mathematically presuppose certain variables and certain constants that are assumed to be so before they ever start doing the math. Without the laws in place, the math can't even be done. The laws were there. So you're exactly right.
Okay, over here for a question. Who's your question to?
Matt, and I have a question. If you don't believe in God, then what's the meaning of life? Because at least other religions, they at least have something to rely on. Well, what do y'all rely on if y'all don't believe that there's any meaning in life?
I believe that every person has the job of finding a meaning. No one's going to prescribe that to you as an atheist or as a humanist. My meaning is to try to make my life as meaningful to someone else. So if that's being supportive of the gay community or making sure that I'm doing something to change this world, this planet, this community, and my community, that's my meaning. That's my purpose. And we can all find something behind that. You get to choose it, though. I can't choose it for you. And when no one has to prescribe it to you, I think you're better off.
Who's your question for?
My question will be for Rip Snow.
You got to put both first and last name there. I mean, I doubt there's another Rip in the whole room. That's okay.
So I belong to a atheist group in Albany, Georgia.
Yes, sir.
We have over 100 members. They're all really great people. To go off how you were saying with morality having to come from a God.
I didn't say that, but go ahead with your question.
Okay. Well, you said that we have to presuppose these things from a moral God.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Yeah, all right. Well, how is it, if we get our morality from God, that we can deem what he says is moral? Would we not, in fact, have to use our own morality to deem if the God would be saying something that was moral or immoral? And that would even go to, if you want to answer God's nature, you would still have to use your own morality to see which side that deity would be on.
Right. But you're assuming something in the question. Your assumption is that we can always know. And that's the problem with it. In what I said, I never said that God gave us our morality. What I said is that God gave us our objective value from which we then intuit morality. I think everybody in this room, I think you can go anywhere in the world, and anthropological studies have proven this. You go anywhere in the world, nobody likes a coward. Nobody wants somebody to steal something from them. Nobody wants somebody to lie to them. Nobody wants somebody to harm anybody else. His methodology of methodological empathy is actually a valid one. I'm not questioning that. All I'm saying is that there is no way to ground it without God in the paradigm, because ultimately, let's just say this entire room thinks that you're dressed inappropriately and that you should die. Well, I don't feel that way. I want you to know that.
I think you look nice.
Yeah, I think you're a nice-looking guy. We're sharing facial hair. It's a good thing. But honestly, there would be no place to appeal that verdict, because there's no place to ground the intuition that you shouldn't die except in a transcendent grounding. And that's the place for God. So you and I can disagree about that, I guess, but I'm just going to say there is no way to ground moral intuitions outside of someone's character being the place where that is grounded. It's not a matter of something sitting above God and saying what's right and wrong, and we just intuitively look past that. It's saying that were it not for God, his very perfection is the fact that he is self-existent. If that's the case, then he grounds all morality, he grounds all value, he grounds all knowledge. So
over here, with that, I would...
Go ahead.
Do I get done? Okay. With that, I would say, to me, that is putting God right in that same gap as we were talking before. That is more God of the gaps. I'm saying that is most likely a product of evolution, and that we have a great etymological tree that shows us where that morality came from in our evolution. So God did it. Again, that's what we've got here, and I just don't see any sense in doing that.
Who's your question for?
For Matt as well. You stated earlier that, neither side can prove one way or the other.
That's right, yeah.
Yes, and I agree with that, factually that's the case. You both presented great arguments, facts, that sort. So in going from that perspective, if there's no way to prove one way or the other, in deciding which way to go, you look at, I suppose, the outcomes of the decisions prior people have made. For instance, you look at people who have chosen Christianity and people who have chosen atheism. And I see in Christianity great things, great stories, inmates that have turned their lives around, and, you see great people, missionaries into the world and doing great things. So I see great results from becoming a Christian or a believer. What are the great results from becoming an atheist? I mean, like I said, there's no proof either way. So I should need to look at the past and decisions other people have made. We learn from others' decisions and mistakes. So why should I choose that? I see great things that come out of becoming a Christian, great things that happen in my life from becoming a Christian. But what great things come from becoming an atheist?
Thank you.
I'm going to kind of answer that in two parts. First, peer pressure should never be the reason you decide to choose a religion or a
purely,
belief set.
just looking at purely.
That's a terrible notion. But most people have. You are born into a family, and usually it's Christian around here. If you were in the Middle East, you would probably be a Muslim. As long as you recognize that, I think you're on a pretty good standing ground, and you can probably make some good decisions from there. If you're going to make it purely on what atheists do, the two richest men in America are atheists, and they give half of their net wealth to charity every year. One is Bill Gates, and the other is Warren Buffett. Those are two upstanding good men that do a lot. This front row, full of good atheist people that do great things for their community and support one another and other people. They don't care what you believe, they will support you regardless. And that what you believe is irrelevant to them. They want to help. That's the case with most atheist organizations. What you'll find is that atheists are more inclusive. If you are GLBT and rejected by your family, you'll probably find a home with an atheist family because you've been thrown out, something like that. And your family's thrown you out, your good Christian family. So where's the good there? The good is varied, of course. We don't have massive monuments to our goodness and our wealth, of course. We're not wealthy and huge like Christian organizations are, but our goodness is certainly there. And if you look for it, you'll find it. I can promise you that.
Would you like a minute to respond, Rick?
Yes, I would. I mean, nobody here has argued that atheists are bad and that Christians are good, or that an atheist can't be better than a Christian. I would say that's entirely feasible. I would say that the Christians who are in this room would be the first to tell you that we don't see ourselves in any sense righteous whatsoever. We've gone somewhere to seek mercy for the fact that we couldn't be righteous. So that's never been an issue for us. And also, this idea that the desire, as you were stating in that monologue a minute ago, to live forever is somehow a desire that makes us want to become Christians is absurd. I'm going to say that's a hatchet with a blade on both sides. The desire of an atheist to do whatever they want without anybody supervising any of that seems to me just as big a desire if I want to do things that I know to be wrong. So I could see where that would be a desire also for an atheist as well. And by the way, the Southern Baptists are the third largest relief organization on earth. So that also applies as well.
Thank you. Question over here. Who's your question for?
Hi, this question's for Matt. I would
Matt.
think that most people who are Christians in this room would say that divinity within me is proof enough for God, but that is not science. So let's talk about science. One of the things that has lacked in this conversation is a discussion of anthropology, sociology, and human history in general.
Okay.
And anyone who has taken a entry-level college anthropology course is aware that there are few, if any, places in the world, including the Amazon or Papua New Guinea, where they do not worship a deity. It may not be the Christian deity, but since the beginning of time, since Stonehenge was created, there has been an intuitive need in the human, whatever you want to call it, to worship a greater being. And so I would be very interested in knowing your thoughts on where you think that comes from.
I don't think that a popular idea is ever a good idea, or never ever necessarily a good idea.
We're not necessarily talking about long, big groups. We might be talking about a small group in the Amazon.
Okay, so
But-
we've asked the question. We'll give you a chance to respond.
Right, but what I'm saying is, just because it happens a lot, or always even, doesn't mean that it's evidence for the fact that God exists. So anthropologically speaking, so what? People have worshiped God. Yeah, we know that. And what does that have to do with whether or not God exists? It doesn't really have anything to do with whether or not God exists. It doesn't prove his existence. It just proves that man tends to want to worship something bigger than himself, or, better yet, explain things that he doesn't understand. That could be a good answer for that. I don't understand this thing that's bigger than me. I don't understand why the sun is being eclipsed by the moon, or I don't even know what those two big balls in the sky are, So it's some deity doing it. It's the dragon swallowing an egg. That's an old legend, I think, from Japan. Those are ideas that were, given deification, but we know better than that now.
Rip,
Do
would you like to
we?
respond for a
Yeah,
minute?
just one thing to... Sure we do. I'm sorry. Just to respond to you, ma'am. I mean, what you just said is absolutely the case. One thing in Matt's, both of our defense, we can't cover every subject in 75 minutes, so I'm sorry we didn't get into the anthropological aspects of Christianity or religion in general, but you're absolutely correct in your observation that there seems to be within humanity a need to recognize power outside itself, a noumenal quality to the universe, an intelligence behind everything that is. I totally agree with you, and that's just undeniable. And the fact that you can say that doesn't prove it to be so, that's absolutely correct. However, that doesn't automatically mean it's not so. If I'm lying in bed and my leg hurts and I know that at dawn I'll be administered a medicine that'll come and take away the pain, the fact that I really want the medicine to come doesn't mean the dawn won't come and the medicine will come. So wishing for something, having a desire to worship doesn't mean that the object of worship is not there any more than it means that it is. So.
Thank you. Question over here.
Thank you.
Okay, my question is for Matt.
Poor Matt.
I'm so popular.
All right, you stated that you don't see any group of people or any human beings being devalued, right? You said by humanists.
Not in the experience that I have from humanists as a philosophy.
Okay. Well, the British Humanists Association has stated that many, many humanists have rallied for abortion to be legalized. So I feel like this is a prime example of, a group being devalued. Do you have anything to say for the 56 million?
Oh, thank you. Put me on the spot, dear.
Thank God I'm not you. That's what
Yeah,
if I can say that.
that guy gets out easy. Abortion.
Oh, I missed the part. Even though scientifically and logically it has been proven that life begins at conception.
Yeah, I don't know that conscious life is kind of where I would say that line should be drawn. I am, God, I'm going to get in trouble with the atheist community on this one once this is aired.
This is being filmed, just so you...
Yeah, I know.
Lasts forever.
I'm going to be nailed up on a cross, thanks to you. I don't like somebody else we've heard of.
Okay, you're down to 30 seconds, so that's pretty good.
All right. Can I keep...
Just vamp.
I believe, and this is not something I can prove, I'm not going to say that I have any evidence for this. Please understand that. I believe that a person has a responsibility whenever they find out that they are pregnant to make the decision as quickly as they can so that late-term abortions are avoided. I don't like that idea. I am not a woman. It is not my place to make that decision. That's not my place. I can't speak for women, and I don't believe that a child or an embryo or, a fertilized egg is a human at that stage. So, or is a viable human. You could also ask the same question of your God, who assumedly is quite okay with the millions of miscarriages that happen all the time. So what about those? Again, I am not a huge activist in that area, so it is not something for me. Please don't crucify me, and God, I know I'm in trouble.
Rip, would you like to respond?
Well, only briefly. I mean, look, if the unborn are not persons, then there's no argument necessary to defend abortion. If they are persons, then no argument is sufficient. And that's really where you have to leave that. There is no argument beyond that. If we're talking about a person, then an abortion is the ending of a human life. And by the way, go to any book of anatomy and any book with regard to human reproduction, and you will find every textbook on earth at any college right now will tell you at the moment of conception you're dealing with an entirely new genetically independent organism from the mother and the father. Keep that in mind before we make decisions about that.
Okay, thank you for your question. Over here, who's your question for?
My question's for Rip Snow.
I keep getting the last name like they wouldn't know who I was.
Well, it's just a really interesting name. Sorry, it's not
That's
every
all right.
day I just get to say Rip Snow.
Okay, it's kind of fun in a way.
Sorry.
That's all right.
So you brought up a couple of things earlier that kind of stuck with me. First thing you brought up is Pascal's wager. That always kind of bugs me.
I'm sorry.
I'm having a hard time hearing
Can't hear you.
The first thing that you brought up was Pascal's wager. That always kind of bugs me.
Bugs a lot of people.
It would. The second thing that you talked about earlier, just to make sure that I didn't misunderstand you, is it okay if I clarify something before?
If you do what?
If I clarify something before
Yes,
my question?
yes, absolutely, especially now because I'm only understanding about 70% of what
You stated earlier that slavery would have collapsed, to get rid of slavery at the time of the Bible, basically.
all at once.
All at once would have
Correct.
collapsed an economy, right?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So basically, say that I agree with Pascal's wager and that there's a God. I don't think there is. There might be. Can't agree. No proof. Whatever. But say there is, and that I'm okay with saying that. Slavery's not okay, ever. I don't care about the economy. Getting rid of slavery would always be more important than an economy, always. It's not okay to subjugate an entire people.
I agree with you.
Ever. Ever. It could be your family, okay? Whipping or like abusing a person ever, even if it's like with candy and rainbows and unicorns and butterflies, it doesn't matter how you do it. Making somebody do something they don't want to do ever is not okay. Also,
I need you to get to your question, please.
right. Also, I would like to know how you deal with a God who lets children starve and like families be torn apart in countries that are full of war, and how is it okay with all of this awful stuff that goes on? How is that okay? Children being gassed and just murdered.
Okay, I get the picture, I
violently.
think. Bad
Right.
things are happening.
How is that okay?
Thank you for the question.
Yeah, okay, it's a good question. It's valid. It's a valid. As a matter of fact, that is one of the thorniest of all the questions that ever gets asked. How do you equate a good, loving, omnipotent, omniscient God with the fact of the evil that's in the world? First of all, you asked really three questions, and I don't know if I got time to deal with all of them. The question of slavery and regarding the Roman Empire, regarding the prehistory, the time behind the Roman Empire, and further back. The Greek philosophers all held slaves, all of them. All of the 25% of the entire population in the Roman Empire were slaves. 25%. Now, if you take that 25% and remove their labor force from the economy would collapse. I'm not standing here in the 21st century and saying I like that, or I'm endorsing that, or I think that's a good thing. That's a terrible thing. But you have to realize we're standing here in this air-conditioned environment with our cars and our food and everything else, and we're looking back in time at a time in history when that was an uncontroversial practice. Nobody thought it controversial. It had no critics, until about 300 years ago, and then it was criticized, and the critique came from the people who believed in God. That's just undeniable. Say whatever you want, there would have been no anti-slavery movement had it not been for the Christians. Research it for yourself. You don't have to believe me. The other aspect of what you said with regard to evil, here's the picture. According to the Christian understanding of the world and its relationship to God, humanity to God, it works this way. There was a time in this world when things weren't as they are. Things are not the way they're supposed to be now. We made a choice. And you say, well, all of these terrible things are happening. How come a good God can let it happen? He must let it happen. Because if he ever imposes a stop to it, none of us are here. Because the evil that we see out there also resides in our heart. Every person in this room has the potentiality to do evil. Every time we give somebody the finger in traffic, there is something of our heart being expressed in that moment that is evil. Further, let's just paint it this way. I hope this will make it understandable. You're in your room at night. You lay there. All of a sudden, the room is flooded with bright lights. And in that moment, you find yourself floating out the window. And when you get out in the middle of the yard, you look up and there's a 100-foot in diameter disc-shaped craft floating over your backyard. And then you find yourself floating into the craft. And then you find these large leathery-skinned creatures giving you some kind of examination within the craft. What will happen? Well, you'll be examined. You won't be able to resist them, and I promise you, you won't like them. That is why God allows the evil to take place. In other words, in a universe where consequences are real, he has to allow that choice. And if he's allowing that choice, then evil is going to be. If he puts a stop to it, he puts a stop to all of us. That's why an omnipotent, omniscient, loving God will permit the evil he permits. If God shows up in this room tonight, all of us will believe 50 years from now, we'll be scratching our heads, our grandchildren will say, did that really happen? That's why he's hidden in that sense, because he is looking for people who will seek him and find him, as Paul said to the Athenian philosophers, though he's not far from any of us.
Thank you, Rick. Would you like a minute to respond?
Yeah, real quick. As Jordan said, even the people that were speaking on God's behalf in the Old Testament didn't have a problem. Even they weren't fixing the slavery problem. They were cool with the 7-year wait. It's a big problem. God, being who he is defined as, could have fixed that. He's pretty good at fixing things, I would think, and could probably find a way to make that happen. But instead, he's able to endorse it, make rules for it, make it okay, and let it last for 7 more years. And then allow it to show up in the Bible so that we're asking questions about it later. So we're not sure anymore. We think of it, maybe we're wrong in the way we're interpreting it. Maybe our exegesis is incorrect, but we're all questioning now whether or not God is okay with slavery. That's a problem. That's a God problem. God failed there, if indeed he exists.
I must respond to that because it's simply a distortion of the actual historical fact, irrespective of the Bible. You have to look at the times into which these things were written. Slavery was not controversial. That doesn't make it right. From our perspective, I totally agree
God
with
can
you.
make things controversial.
Not without bypassing
through
all
the
of
people
us.
that speak to him.
He has to bypass
him.
all of us to do
Each
it.
of you speak.
He has to bypass us. That means he has to eliminate us in all of our humanity in order to communicate something like that and bring it to an end. I have to say, if he does that, then none of us are here. Because within every human heart, evil exists. And as far as the slavery question, yes, I agree with you. There are things about capitalism that you could point to and say that those are evil as well. I think we could all find them if we wanted to. But God works with those of us who are here in the time in which we are. He doesn't bypass us. And as a matter of fact, you said something early on this evening that I just almost jumped out of my seat. Yes, I doubt too. But if I didn't doubt, that would mean there was no room for me. God allows for that as well. Yes, sir.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, question over here. Who's your question for?
Yeah, it's for Rip. Early in your opening statement, you appealed to the Kalam cosmological argument.
In an indirect way.
Sure. And then after you employed that argument, you jumped directly to biblical testimony. Jesus rising from the dead and all this, but there was never the establishment of how you get from, if we were to say for the sake of argument that there was a cause, you never established how you get from that cause to the God of the Bible.
Well, I must have not stated it well then because I thought I did that. I said that the only way you can have a cause outside the universe, which is all of the spatio-temporal reality we see, that cause has to be completely outside all of that physicality. Did I not say that?
Sure, but
the tape will be there, I guess.
But how does that jump to specifically the Christian God and not Allah or Zeus or any of the thousands of other gods that have existed throughout time?
It didn't. It jumped to monotheism.
So that's what I'm asking is how do you get from that cause to the Christian God?
Because of volitional will.
In other words, one question. You can ask the question and then later
It's a good question. I'm not trying to dismiss you. It's an excellent question. And it's one that was a problem for me early on in my life as a believer. The reason that you can make the leap, it's not a leap. If you come to that point at which there is absolute non-being, nothing. Now, Lawrence Krauss's book talks about nothing as the quantum vacuum. The quantum vacuum is a place of roiling energy exchange in a symmetrical way. That's not nothing, that's something. We're talking about ex nihilo, just as Matt said, from absolute non-being. In order for something to appear from absolute non-being at a point in time and space, when there is no time, the cause has to be simultaneous with the effect in that sense. Of that instant when the universe began, the cause was there. In the same way this stage is here holding me up. I'm simultaneous with the stage. The cause of me being 4 feet up from where you are is this wooden stage. I'm simultaneous as I'm the effect, the stage is the cause. We're simultaneously existing. That's the reason why it has to be a non-corporeal, timeless, immaterial being who makes an act of volitional will in the nothingness that was. Otherwise, it would never happen. There would be no occurrence of it. Just like if I pick something up and I say, you know what, I'm going to hold this, I'm defying the gravity that is. I decide whether to drop it or not. In that instance, I make a volitional, willful act. The intention is already there. The intention for the universe was there, and then God caused it to be.
All right, I need you to land.
I'm sorry.
Thank you, Rip. All right, we're running out of time. We have 6 more questions, so here's what we're going to do.
It's a good question.
Ask the question. Don't go over about 30 seconds, or I'm going to ask you to stop. Y'all are going to have to keep your answers to 1 minute. We're going
Impossible.
way too long, or else we're not going to give everybody a chance. I know it's hard, but we're going to have to go that route. Question over here.
Yeah, my question is for you, Matt. I want to ask you what are your views on the fact that Darwin himself, who I would consider a patriarch in your faith, said that without the missing link, so to say, the evidence of evolution, because you're saying there's no evidence that there's God, we have not seen evidence of evolution, said that without that evidence, it is absurd to not consider a God creator.
I challenge you to go home, Google the word phylogenetic tree. It is a huge picture of missing links, just huge. You can also look at all the human preforms. There are missing links. They have been found. There are lots of them. Every individual species between us, our children, are links between us and the next species. That's how evolution works. The average individual in America does not properly understand evolution. We don't have time, unfortunately, I really wish we did, to get into the actual science of evolution. But generally speaking, we don't understand that every person is transitional. Every bird is transitional to the next species. So it's like the phases of the moon. Every moon is transitioning to the next phase of the moon. And that does not change us from, that does not mean that there aren't transitional species. Every bone that is found is a transitional species. Every one is some change in between, some part of it. That's up to him.
I just want to respond to that. Even if all of that is true, it only explains what happens once you have life.
Yes, and what I meant was evolution, evidence of evolution, not adaptation.
No, even
that is evolution.
As a Christian,
adaptation is evolution.
No, it's not.
I got to come to Matt's defense here for just a second. And I'm not an evolutionist directly. I'm just saying, even if everything Matt said is absolutely the case, it could be. If it is, it makes no difference, because evolution, even Darwin said this, even Richard Dawkins admits this, evolution only explains what happens once you have life. Does not explain the origin of it, only what happens after you've got it. The replicator has to be there.
Thank you.
Question over here.
Hey, I just wanted to say thank y'all for coming to Waycross and bringing this to us. I'm born and raised here, so I respect y'all. My question is for you, Mr. Snow, and I don't mean to be rude by saying this, but I caught something that you said that I found very interesting. And in terms of what you said, how do you, if money is the congealed version of life, what is the monetary value of humans?
To say money is congealed life is merely a shortcut of saying that money is congealed effort and labor. That's what it is. In other words, you are spent, let me put it to you this way. You're born and you're going to die, right? You've got this fixed commodity from birth to death. You're going to spend it. You don't get any of it back. So every minute that you spend earning money, you are spending that fixed commodity and it goes away. That's all I meant. It's not to say that there's a value, a monetary value in life. It's simply a way of shorthand saying, yes, when we spend our time, we're saying the most literal thing we can because we've got a fixed amount of it.
It's just confusing because there's a cult called the Illuminati that kind of sounds like what you said, so I just wanted to make sure that you knew that.
No, I'm not a member of the Illuminati, that's for certain.
Yeah.
Okay.
I wasn't saying that you were, I'm just saying, just, be careful how you phrase things because it kind of caught me off guard.
Oh, well, thank you for saying that. It was merely a shorthand.
Okay.
Question over here. Who's your question for?
Mr. Matt. Hey, I want to say thank you so much on both your behalves.
Thank you.
I don't agree with laziness on either side. Question everything. It's a good point.
Wonderful.
And my question is since you understand psychology and the approach of evangelism and sitting down and opening yourself up and you will feel something, then the evangelist has a book that we read and we're called to do this and we're held accountable. Who holds someone accountable that does it on the other end?
What do you mean by that? Who holds an account? You have to explain that a little better.
If I was arguing, if I was arguing the other half, right, like the side of take the red pill and unplug yourself from the system, right?
Okay. Yeah. I like the Matrix.
Yeah. So my question would be is if you were to take someone aside and say, hey, believe my way, who holds you accountable?
Who holds me accountable for that? No one. I approach things in a certain way, and that is I have a deep concern for humanity, and I have a deep passion for religion. Those things come together for me. So I know that whenever I was going through my phase of doubt, dark night of the soul, or however you want to put that into a concept or words, I really had a hard time with it. So it's important for me to make myself available and the resources of my life experience available to other people that may be going through that same thing. So I don't go after disproving God. I was challenged to this debate, and not the other way around. I go after helping people through whatever they're going through as far as doubt and disbelief, so long as they can land softly wherever they're going to land. That's important to me. Because whenever I was in, and this is going to get to an emotional high a little bit, when I was going through my doubts, I nearly killed myself because my God was dying. That was very difficult for me. If you've ever been through that, you know what it you might know what it feels like. It's very difficult. There are people here that know what that's like. There are people that have no clue. But it's a very difficult time, and I don't think people should have to go through that alone. That's all.
Thank you.
We have one last question over here.
Questions for Rip Snow? Can these two?
Speak up. Yeah, no, one last on this side.
Mine's
then
for
we'll get
Rip.
these two.
Okay, I got you. I'm sorry.
Can you speak up just a little?
Yes, sir. Rip, if you're an unsaved person, can you understand the scriptures? Does it say that in the Word?
Yes, it does. 1 Corinthians, Paul's first letter to the church at Corinth, says that a person who doesn't have the Spirit of God within them sees all of this as foolishness. Now, you can make of that what you will. I would agree with that, obviously. Sure. I think the evidence for it is standing right here. I mean, it's foolishness to him. But I will admit, to come to Matt's defense, that it wasn't always so. So I don't really know, other than just answering your question straight away. The Bible does say that.
I want to thank everyone for coming out. I appreciate your participation, to all the questions asked. I do want to mention this. Please give a hand to these guys.
Thank you. Thank you.
Before you're dismissed, I do want to make one announcement. If you asked a question tonight at the mics, and you do not want your question and the response to be included in the video, please send an email through the contact form on the God or No God debate site. We will get that, and we will remove that, because this video will be put out on the site, will be on YouTube. So if you're not comfortable with that, then please let us know. Other than that, have a great night. Thank you for sticking around.